The year was 1968, and Chuck Berry had been carrying something for a long time. Not bitterness exactly, not jealousy, something quieter than both of those. Something that lived behind his eyes when he read certain magazine covers, when he walked past certain record store windows, when someone at a party mentioned a name he'd been hearing too often for too long. He'd built something. He'd built the architecture that everybody else was now living in, and nobody seemed to remember the name of the architect. He was 41 years old. In rock and roll terms, that was a different species entirely. The occasion was a private industry gathering in Chicago, October 1968, held in the back rooms of a club on the South Side that had been rented out for the evening by a record label executive who liked to throw the kind of parties where the guest list looked like a hallucination. The kind of gathering where you turned a corner and found yourself standing next to someone whose face you'd only ever seen on an album cover. 30, maybe 40 people total. Enough that you could have a real conversation. Small enough that you couldn't hide. Chuck arrived early, as he always did. He found a chair near the back wall, accepted a drink from a passing tray, and began watching the room fill up with people who all seemed to be performing a version of themselves they thought the occasion required. He was good at watching rooms. He'd been doing it since before most of these people were born. Jimi Hendrix arrived around 9:30. He came in with two people Chuck didn't recognize, wearing something that looked like it had been assembled from the contents of three separate closets. His guitar case slung over one shoulder, as though he'd simply forgotten to leave it in the car. He scanned the room with the easy attention of someone who was comfortable in unfamiliar spaces, not searching for anything specific, just orienting himself. Someone introduced them within the first 20 minutes. Chuck shook his hand and felt the guitar calluses, which he always noticed first with other players. A reflex from decades of sizing people up. The calluses were substantial. He filed that away without letting it change his expression. They talked briefly. Surface conversation, the kind that industry parties generated like weather. Chuck mentioned he'd heard "Are you experienced?" He said it carefully, the way you said things when you hadn't decided yet how honest to be. Jimmy said genuinely that he'd grown up listening to Maybelline, that Johnny B. Good had been one of the first songs he'd ever tried to learn on guitar. He said it without strategy, without the particular tone that people sometimes used when they were trying to flatter someone they considered past their prime. He said it the way you mentioned something that was simply true. Chuck nodded. He'd heard that kind of thing before. He knew how to receive it without letting it mean too much. The conversation drifted, the way conversations did at those gatherings. Other people inserted themselves. Jimmy was pulled away towards someone else, and Chuck watched him go and turn back to his drink in the comfortable position of the observer. It was maybe an hour later when someone produced a guitar. These things happened at certain kinds of parties. Someone would know someone who knew where an instrument was kept, and the next thing you knew, there was an acoustic guitar being passed around a corner of the room. This particular guitar was a Gibson J45, well worn, the lacquer rubbed through in several places along the neck. Someone played a few chords. Someone else took it, played something better. Jimmy had the guitar in his hands before Chuck fully registered how that had happened. He was sitting on the edge of a low table, the J45 across his knee, not performing anything yet, just holding it, adjusting the tuning slightly with the focused, unhurried attention of someone making sure a thing was right before they used it. The room around him continued its noise, but the noise was already beginning to pull back, the way background sound recedes when something in the foreground starts to matter. Chuck watched from where he was standing, across the room, drink in hand. He was watching with the particular attention of someone who had an argument they hadn't finished making yet. It had been building in him for months, maybe longer. The way the magazines wrote about Hendrix as though he'd materialized from nothing. The way critics described his playing as though the guitar had never been played that way before. As though no one had ever bent a string, as though the blues hadn't existed. Chuck Berry had been bending strings before Jimi Hendrix had been born. The duck walk, the double stop runs, the way he used rhythm and lead simultaneously, the entire physical vocabulary of electric guitar performance, it had come from somewhere. It had come from people. It had come from him and from the people who'd come before him, and nobody in the press seemed to think that was worth mentioning anymore. He set his drink down. He walked over to where Jimmy was sitting. The small crowd parted, recognizing him, and Jimi looked up. "You know," Chuck said, and his voice was even, measured, carrying the specific weight of a man who had been thinking about something for a long time and had finally decided to say it out loud. "What you're doing, what they're all writing about. You didn't invent that." The room got quieter. Not silent, not yet, but the conversations nearest to them dropped to a lower register, people beginning to pay attention without quite looking like they were paying attention. Jimi looked at him. His expression didn't change into anything defensive. He just looked. "Strings were bent before you picked up a guitar," Chuck continued. "The sounds you're making, the feedback, the sustain. People were doing things like that. You built on something. You didn't build from nothing." It was true in the way that complicated things are true. Chuck wasn't wrong. He was also doing something else, and some part of him knew it, but he was too deep into the sentence to change course. Jimi was quiet for a moment. Just a moment. "You're right," he said. Chuck hadn't expected that. He'd expected something else, some form of pushback, the kind that would have given him somewhere to direct the rest of what he was feeling. "You're right," Jimi said again, simply. "I learned from you. I learned from people who learned from you. From people you learn from. That's all I was doing." Following the thread, he looked down at the guitar in his hands. Then he said quietly to no one in particular, "Let me show you where the thread went," and he started playing. He didn't announce what he was playing. There was no preamble, no settling in, no warm-up. He simply began, and what he began was Johnny Be Good, Chuck Berry's song, the one Jimi had mentioned learning as a child, the one that had been on the radio since 1958, that had sold millions of copies, that every guitarist of a certain generation had used as a proving ground, because if you could play Johnny Be Good, you could play rock and roll. The first four bars were recognizable. The opening riff, the one Chuck had written, the one that had probably been played more times in guitar stores and garages and basements than any other single piece of music in rock history. Jimi played it straight, clean, on an acoustic guitar with no amplification, every note exact. And then he kept playing. He kept playing, and the song stopped being the song Chuck knew. It didn't stop being recognizable. You could still hear the structure underneath, the changes, the shape of it. But Jimi was playing it the way you might recognize a river you'd seen before, but had never seen in flood. The banks were the same. Everything inside them was different. He was playing rhythm and lead simultaneously, his thumb working the bass line while his fingers found melodic ideas above it, creating the impression of a full arrangement with 6 strings and 10 fingers on an unamplified acoustic guitar in the corner of a Chicago club. He was finding harmonic content in the chord shapes that Chuck had never put there, or rather that Chuck had put there without knowing they were there, and Jimi was pulling them out into the light and showing them off. He bent strings on an acoustic guitar, which was harder to do and sounded different when you did, more physical, more committed, like the guitar was resisting and being asked to yield anyway. He found rhythmic pockets inside the song that made you want to move even though the room had gone almost entirely still. He played it like a man having a private conversation with a song he'd known his whole life and was finally saying everything he'd always meant to say to it. Chuck Berry stood 3 feet away and did not move. He had been expecting competence. He had been prepared for impressive. He had built, without quite admitting he'd built it, a small internal case for why what he was about to see would confirm what he already believed, which was that Jimi Hendrix was talented, genuinely talented, but working in a tradition he hadn't earned the right to claim. What he was seeing was something else. What he was seeing was his own song opened up like a piece of machinery by someone who understood it, possibly better than he did, certainly differently. Jimi wasn't playing it better in any simple sense of the word. Better wasn't the right frame. He was playing it from the inside, showing Chuck angles of the architecture Chuck himself had designed but had never seen from those particular positions. The room was completely silent now. Not the polite silence of an audience waiting for a performer to finish. The stunned silence of people witnessing something they didn't have a category for. Glasses had been lowered. Conversations abandoned mid-sentence. Jimi didn't play for long, maybe 3 minutes, maybe a little more. He didn't build to a dramatic finish. He simply played until he reached a natural stopping point, found a place where the song could rest and let it. The silence after he stopped had a different quality than the silence during. During it had been held breath. After, it was the sound of a room full of people releasing something they hadn't known they were holding. Someone started clapping first. Then others joined. Not the enthusiastic clapping of a concert crowd, not performance applause. The careful, deliberate applause of people in the presence of something they wanted to honor correctly. Jimmy set the guitar down on the table beside him and looked at Chuck. He didn't say anything. He didn't have the expression of someone who had won something. He had the expression of someone who had been trying to say something true and hoped it had come out right. Chuck looked at him for a long moment. He was not a man who found it easy to say certain kinds of things out loud. He lived through decades that had made it necessary to keep certain interior states carefully guarded, to perform confidence even when confidence wasn't what he felt. Because showing the other thing, the doubt, the hurt, the complexity, had too often been used against him. He'd built a hard exterior because the world he'd moved through had required it, and that exterior had become, over time, simply the way he existed in rooms. What he said finally was, "Where did you learn to play it like that?" Jimmy looked slightly surprised. "From you," he said. "Like I said." Chuck shook his head slowly. "I never played it like that." "You put it in there," Jimmy said. "Everything I played, it was in the song already. I just listened for it." That was either the most generous thing anyone had ever said to him or the most devastating. And Chuck Berry stood there, unable to decide which it was. He picked up his drink from the nearby table. He didn't say anything else. He walked back to his chair near the wall and sat down and spent the rest of the evening watching the room in a different way than he'd watched it before. The party continued around him. Conversations resumed, people moved from group to group, the room returned to its noise. Chuck watched all of it with the careful attention he'd always used to watch rooms, but something in his interior calculation had been altered. Some equation he'd been running for years had come out differently than it always had, and he was sitting with the new answer, not sure yet what to do with it. He didn't speak to Jimmy again that night. He drove home alone, through Chicago streets that were empty at that hour, the city quiet in the particular way it got quiet in the early morning. Both hands on the wheel, headlights cutting through the dark. He didn't tell anyone about that night, not for years. He was not, by temperament or by history, the kind of man who talked about the moments that had gotten past his defenses. Those moments were private, held close, examined only when he was alone with enough time and silence to be honest with himself. But he thought about it. He thought about it in the way you think about something that has changed the shape of a question you've been asking. Not erasing the question, not resolving it, just changing what the question meant, what its answer might look like, what it would take to actually hear it. The thing he kept coming back to, the image that stayed with him through the weeks and then the months that followed, was not the playing itself. It was what Jimmy had said before he started. "Let me show you where the thread went. Not where I took it, not what I did with it. Where it went, as though it had gone somewhere on its own, as though the music had a direction that both of them were simply following, each from their own position, each from their own time, neither of them owning it, both of them serving it." Chuck Berry had spent decades fighting for credit he'd earned, and he had earned it. The record was real, the history was real, the people who had borrowed without acknowledging were real, and his anger about it was legitimate and would remain legitimate regardless of anything else. But that night in Chicago had put something else alongside the anger, not replacing it. Alongside it, the recognition that the music he'd made had gone somewhere he hadn't sent it, had grown into something he hadn't planted, and that this was, in some way he didn't entirely understand, the point of it. The whole point. The reason you made the thing in the first place, so that it could leave you and go somewhere you couldn't follow. Jimi Hendrix died in September 1970. He was 27 years old. Chuck Berry heard the news and felt something he didn't have a precise name for, which was unusual for him because he was a precise man, a compound of things. Grief, which surprised him, because he hadn't thought he'd felt close enough to the man to grieve him. Something adjacent to regret, which he examined carefully and then set aside as too easy an emotion. too soft at the edges. And underneath both of those, something heavier and harder to move, the specific weight of an unfinished conversation. He hadn't apologized for what he'd said that night. He hadn't been sure it required an apology. He'd said something true, and Jimmy had received it with more grace than it had perhaps deserved. And then Jimmy had said something back that had required years to fully understand. That wasn't a conversation that needed an apology. It was a conversation that needed time. There was no more time now. In a 1987 interview with a music journalist who'd been persistent enough to earn a few real answers, Chuck Berry talked about that night for the first time publicly, though he didn't use Jimmy's name directly, referring to him only as a younger guitarist he'd encountered in Chicago. He said that the experience had changed his thinking about influence, about what it meant to pass something on, about whether the people who came after you were standing on your shoulders or continuing something you'd both been handed by people neither of you had known. The journalist asked him what specifically had changed his thinking. He was quiet for a moment. "He played my song," Chuck said finally, "and I heard things in it I'd never put there. Or maybe I had put them there and never knew it. I still haven't figured out which." He paused. "Either way," he said, "it was my song, and it was bigger than my song. Both things were true at the same time." The journalist waited to see if there was more. There wasn't. Some things don't resolve. They just find a place where they can rest.